In a speech and he'd kind of talked about this back at Jackson Hole, Wyoming in August. Bernanke said members of the FOMC would consider a range of tools to promote stronger economic growth when they meet later in September. Now, here is exactly what Bernanke said.
And indeed, to strengthen over time, the committee has responded to recent developments, as I've already noted, by marking down its outlook for economic growth over coming quarters. The committee also continues to anticipate that inflation will moderate over time to a rate at or below the 2% or a bit less that most FOMC participants consider to be consistent with the committee's dual mandate to promote maximum employment and price stability.
Okay. A little strange. He said, we see little indication the higher rate of inflation experienced so far this year has become ingrained in the economy. I want to find out where Bernanke buys his groceries. I want to find out where he fills up his car with gasoline. I want to find out where he buys his shirts. Because as I've been looking at the commodities markets, these things have all gone up. Oil, food, grains, meats, cotton. And they've worked their way into the economy. No inflation, no problem there, especially for people who don't want to eat, drive a car, or put a shirt on their backs. Everybody else, though, a little bit of inflation. And then Bernanke went on to say this.
In addition to refining our forward guidance, the Federal Reserve has a range of tools that could be used to provide additional monetary stimulus. We discussed the relative merits and costs of such tools at our August meeting. My FOMC colleagues and I will continue to consider those and other pertinent issues, including, of course, economic and financial developments, at our meeting in September, and we are prepared to employ those tools as appropriate to promote a stronger economic recovery in a context of price stability.
Those tools, what tools? We don't know. He didn't come quite out and say QE3, quantitative easing round 3. The Fed policy right now is ZIRP, Z-I-R-P, a zero interest rate policy, at least for the next 2 years. And unofficially, we have Operation Twist. Just don't call it QE3. Apparently, the Fed doesn't want to call it QE3. Apparently, that makes people nervous. But we do know about Operation Twist. Fed's next move is going to be shifting around some $2.8 trillion in the balance sheet of holdings of more longer-term securities. And the point of that kind of a move would be to twist down interest rates for longer maturities. That might potentially spur some mortgage refinance and other activity that depends on longer-term interest rates. At least that's the theory. Yesterday, Chicago Federal Reserve Bank President Charles Evans was calling for pledging to maintain ultra-loose monetary policy until they reach that dual mandate that includes seeing unemployment come down to a more acceptable and possibly even a specified level. Here's what Evans said. He said, the most reasonable interpretation of our maximum employment objective is an unemployment rate near its natural rate, and a fairly conservative estimate of that natural rate is 6%. So when unemployment stands at 9%, we're missing on our employment mandate by a full 3 percentage points. That's as bad as 5% inflation versus a 2% inflation target. So if 5% inflation would have our hair on fire, so should 9% unemployment. Yeah. Back to Bernanke, a more modest step under consideration would be for the central bank to encourage lending by lowering the rate it pays banks for excess reserves they hold at the Fed. Okay. Bernanke said unusually weak household spending, persistent financial strains spurred by worry over Europe's sovereign debt crisis, and the loss of Washington's top-tier credit rating continue to hold back the economy. He also warned that overzealous belt-tightening by the U.S. government in the near term could also slow down the erratic recovery. At times, Bernanke sounds reasonable. Sometimes he almost sounds reasonable. But he just can't quite get past being a puppet for the banks. monetary policy manipulations don't correct malinvestment. It just tweaks malinvestment. Here, let me give you the quote of the day. This comes from Nassim Nicholas Taleb and Mark Spitznagel on a blog entitled The Great Bank Robbery. The American economy, and for many other developed economies, the elephant in the room is the amount of money paid to bankers over the last 5 years. In the United States, the sum stands at an astounding $2.2 trillion. Extrapolating over the coming decade, the number would approach $5 trillion, an amount vastly larger than what both President Barack Obama's administration and his Republican opponents seem willing to cut from further government deficits. That $5 trillion is not money invested in building roads, schools, or other long-term projects, but is directly transferred from the American economy to the personal accounts of bank executives and employees. Such transfers represent as cunning attacks on everyone else as one can imagine. It feels quite iniquitous that bankers, having helped cause today's financial and economic troubles, are the only class that is not suffering from them, and in many cases are actually benefiting. Good point. Good point. Meanwhile, we continue to see the idea of Operation Twist and the idea that the Fed can help solve these problems of unemployment with monetary policy. And part of the problem is that rates have been low for 3 years now, and that isn't spurring people to buy. Companies won't hire unless demand is there. The Fed can lower the cost of credit, but it can't force companies to create jobs. The Fed doesn't create the demand just by lowering the price. If so, guess what? The housing market's been the problems in the housing market have been eradicated, because today Freddie Mac released the results of its primary mortgage market survey showing mortgage rates, fixed and adjustable, hitting all-time record lows. The previous record lows for mortgages for fixed rate, let's see, the 5-year ARM set its all-time low at 2.96, 30-year fixed rate averaging 4.12 with an average 0.7 point for the week ending September 8th. Last year at this time, we were at 4.35. With 30-year mortgage rates now at record lows, mortgage refinance activity is expected to pick up some in September, but so far, refinance activity, is lower than in 2009 and much lower than in 2003. Even though rates are low, and many people might want to refinance, the banks aren't doing many refis, and really aren't that many people trying to get refis. So what's wrong with this picture? Well, let's see if I have this straight. We replace 5% mortgages on underwater homes with 4% on underwater homes. And we pretend the problem is solved? The Fed's Operation Twist will move out the duration curve and buy 7 to 30-year treasuries, and the government will provide hundreds of billions of dollars in fresh, longer-term debt to meet this phony demand. So instead of 2% yields on debts issued by a country with debt to GDP approaching 100%, this scheme calls for a 1.8% yield on a country with a debt to GDP approaching 110%. Is this a fake asset? I mean, talk about the potential for enormous losses once the bubble bursts. We're creating a debt bubble. That seems to be the process. We go from one bubble to the next. Since there's no longer any income left for traditional securities lendings, what do the banks do? All that's left is for them to scalp a few basis points in front of the Fed. Okay, more on this in just a moment, and we'll start to figure out what the president's been saying as far as how he's going to save us all on the jobs front. We know that the economy has to add at least 125,000 jobs a month just to prevent the unemployment rate from rising. So far, the recovery has added about 144,000 jobs per month on average. Not really enough to keep it going. Some familiar ideas that we think were going to be laid out over the next few minutes by the president include a payroll tax cut. According to the CBO, every $1 billion in payroll tax cuts creates 13,000 new jobs. That would also include an extension of unemployment benefits. CBO study found that every $1 billion in unemployment benefits creates 19,000 new jobs. That's because the unemployed tend to get those unemployment checks and spend them. The cuts will cost about $170 billion. Other tax cuts include a business tax credit for unemployed workers. Then there's Public Works Project. This is along the lines of the ARRA stimulus, which was the shovel-ready public works projects. Small business aid, that might be a way that we're going to see to create jobs, likely adding to the already existing small business stimulus package. Other ideas might be streamlining the patent office. Whatever it is, it's got to be a little bit more specific than what we heard in the State of the Union address. And we'll see if we can actually get to that point. The idea of a payroll tax cut, that's an interesting idea, in part because it's really kind of a raid on Social Security. Our political system talks about reforming Social Security to preserve it for a few more years. And then we've got this temporary payroll tax cut, which has been around for a year and may be extended. Effective for all of 2011, we know that it reduces the employee portion of the Social Security tax from 6.2 to 4.2%. So there's a little extra spending money out there. And collectively, it's more than a little. It's about $100 billion for the year. The idea is that we'd spend this extra money. That would nudge up GDP, create jobs somehow, somewhere. Yet GDP and consumer spending are up a bit despite dropping real wages and consumer confidence sagging, falling off a cliff. However, we still have the mind-boggling trade deficit, particularly in consumer goods. Sees to it that much of this extra money is actually going overseas, and it certainly hasn't created jobs in the U.S., as we know from our jobs report. But here's the one thing the payroll tax cut did do very effectively. It rated the Social Security Fund by $100 billion, and now they're proposing to rate it again. To be fair, let's toss in the employer portion. Combined, it amounts to somewhere close to $180 to $200 billion for next year. Why not make it permanent? Well, because letting it expire would be decried, much like today, as a huge jobs-destroying tax hike, while the $2.6 trillion Social Security Trust Fund just sits there, fat, with all that money. So, if we wanted to phase out our Social Security Trust Fund, that would be one way of doing it. After a decade or so, it would be gone. China would have, well, a quarter of it, maybe more. The rest would be spread around. End of story. Would finally be rid of it. See, that's the trick. There are always tricks to this. Cut the payroll tax, and you're going to be raiding Social Security effectively. Okay.